Well, hello again, fellow investigative interviewers. Welcome to another episode of The Practitioner. Today, we're going to continue with the topic of trauma-informed interviewing. In the previous session, we talked about how trauma-informed interviewing should be more than a mere buzzword, meaning that it is necessary and must be meaningful. It must be based on scientific discovery and used within a framework approach, as opposed to becoming a strict linear process. It must be focused on the person being interviewed, who is often an individual with specific needs and idiosyncratic behaviors. We emphasize the need for interviewers to have a healthy understanding of human behavior, human memory, and the effect trauma may have on it. In short, an interviewer requires education more than mere training to do this properly without resorting to a one-size-fits-all approach. An educational trajectory would speak to the science that could help us to better understand an interviewee's behaviors, choices, and perceptions, thereby putting us in a better position to know how to use any subsequent training in a nuanced and contextually based manner. We'll begin our education today with what is referred to as survival mode, which is what happens at the time of the traumatic experience. Then we'll move into the effect on the survivor's self-perception and how they might present during the actual interview process. Survival mode is a state caused by stress and fear, where part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for intellectual thought, becomes impaired, leading us to rely on reflexes and habits to survive. One of these survival reflexes is freezing, where we are focused on detecting, we are shocked, and we don't usually make good choices. If we survive this reflex stage, we may move to self-protection habits, such as being polite, passive, or even submissive. There might not be much thought put into these responses, as we would simply be going to what has worked for us before when facing a threat. If there is no perceived escape, we move to what are referred to as extreme survival reflexes, such as tonic and collapsed immobility. Tonic may present as paralysis that might appear as an inability to move, speak. Collapsed has physiological causes, which may lead to faintness, sleepiness, loss of consciousness, or even loss of muscle tone. It is much more complex and debilitating than simply freezing, and an interviewer must listen intently to pick up on this extreme reflex response. Another extreme reflex is referred to as dissociation, where the survivor may report being blanked out, spaced out, disconnected from the body, or even on autopilot. Now, the list of reflexes or habits could also include fighting or fleeing, but we must accept that the absence of these responses should never be interpreted or used as a reason to disbelieve the survivor. As you can see, there is a lot more to trauma response than using the 4 Fs: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Let's talk about the possible effect trauma might have on how a witness might perceive himself and how we as an interviewer might perceive him. Many years ago, I was held hostage at gunpoint, and I'm pretty certain that I was traumatized from the experience, both during and after. I believe I went through everything we just talked about earlier. My initial response was to freeze, and then, upon believing that death was imminent, I experienced what may have been both tonic and collapsed immobility. I even think that I experienced dissociation at several points. I struggled to make wise choices during the situation, and even now question some of my decisions. Should I have done more than stand there like a statue? Why didn't I try to shoot him? Why didn't I say anything profound or enlightening? What happened to my normally good de-escalation skills? Why did I give my revolver to him when he demanded it? Could I have done better? Now, following my release, I was ashamed to talk about the fact that I had handed my service weapon over, as I had recalled it should never be an option from, of all places, a movie called The Onion Field. For me, this was extremely painful, and I felt re traumatized when interviewed and whenever someone asked me to tell them what happened. I also felt ashamed that I had considered shooting the suspect in the back of the head when he had offered to return my gun before he had let me go. I didn't. Just thinking about it stayed with me because in my mind, I had murdered him when he was no longer an immediate threat to me. I felt ashamed that I had not saved the other hostages from having to experience the fear that they did. I recalled the look of disappointment when they saw me being taken hostage and not saving them by shooting the suspect. I recall the absolute despair of having all control taken from me that night and vowing to never, ever, ever let it happen again. For years, my attempts to regain control over my life led to unhealthy behaviors such as perfectionism, workaholism, and even fear of failure. Now, isn't it funny how this was the result of something that I actually had little control over in the first place? I mentioned this episode in my life as if my responses, reactions, and perceptions had been so bizarre, then why should we not believe it could happen to anyone else? In fact, we should expect that many people who experience a traumatic event will perceive themselves and their decisions in a negative light, and it could reveal itself if we are willing to be alert to it during the interview process. If we do, we may be able to make the interview less traumatic by accepting behavior that could be different than we have experienced from other interviewees, by returning or transferring control back to the person who needs it the most, witness. Here are a few effects on the witness's presentation that we might observe and should accept as a result of trauma. Although many people recall memory of an episode in a nonlinear or non-chronological order, it may be even more pronounced for a traumatized witness. Trauma may cause a witness to focus on senses and sensory detail that may appear odd to another person. For example, the violent or aggressive nature of the event could lead to a focus on the smell of the attacker's breath, for example, or the texture of a carpet. Other sensory information, some of which we might assume should have been encoded, might not have been. We should not question a witness's credibility simply because we might not understand the reason for this phenomenon. Many people tend to focus on what they perceive to be the most immediate and realistic threat to them, and this could cause them to not encode other details. This has been referred to as tunnel vision or weapon focus. An example from my hostage taking was when I could recall fine-grained detail about the RPK assault rifle that had been in my face, but didn't notice the hostage taker's eye color. A person who has had a traumatic experience might not express the same emotions that we might expect them to. And if they do, they may not be expressed at the same point in the account that we would expect to have observed them. We have only touched the surface of the education required to be a trauma-informed interviewer. But I do hope that this has helped us get past common myths about victim behavior related to not fighting, not saying no, not avoiding the attacker after the fact, not showing emotion, not recalling everything, and not keeping to an expected order. We must vehemently avoid what we call the me trap, as even if we had experienced a similar event, we would never be the person we are interviewing and never experience a traumatic situation in the same way. I hope today's discussion has moved us past the point of assuming a witness lacks credibility or reliability because trauma has led him or her to present differently than we had expected. So that's all for today. The next segment will focus on the trauma-informed interview itself and how we can reach our goals of obtaining complete and reliable information while not causing harm to the witness. I would like to sincerely thank Dr. Jim Hopper and Dr. Chris Wilson for helping me to better understand this topic. I do hope that I've expressed this well, and any errors are mine, not theirs.